A few more seconds and then we are ready to rock and roll. So now I guess it's 4 o'clock here in Copenhagen, 3 p.m. in the UK. So I guess I can say good afternoon to everybody. My name is David Sabernik. I'm the head of business development and public affairs with the Danish-Swedish life science cluster organization, Medicon Valley Alliance. And on behalf of Medicon Valley Alliance, it's a pleasure for me to welcome members and potential members to this inspirational webinar organized with our member company, Informa Pharma Intelligence. We have two excellent speakers from Informa, Thomas and Elizabeth, who will take over in a minute. So I hope you will fasten your seatbelts and enjoy the ride. And if you get inspired not only by the content of today's webinar, but also by the concept, and start to wonder whether it would make sense for your company, your organization, to set up a similar webinar with Medicon Valley Alliance, feel free to reach out to me. My contact info is available on our webpage, and it will also be published on the final slide at the end of this webinar. I also encourage you to visit our webpage event calendar, where you will find a handful of newly published inspirational seminars that might also be of interest to you. And feel free to look at the webpage and see if any of Medicon Valley Alliance networks could be of interest to you. As an employee with a Medicon Valley Alliance company, you can attend network meetings free of charge. You can attend as many meetings and as many networks as you like. The easiest way to keep updated on all these informations and activities is actually to subscribe to our newsletter, which you can also do from our webpage. A few practical remarks, as you can see on the slide here. Our household rules, it's pretty much standard operating procedure. As you can see, you're automatically muted. We use the chat for technical questions and the Q&A, which of course is the important part for questions. You will receive, as you can see, an email with a link to the recordings. We are recording this webinar. So if you miss out on something, you can revisit the webinar. It will also be published on Medicon Valley Alliance YouTube channel. But I guess enough said on my part. I'm not the reason why you tuned in today. So let's get started. And without further ado, over to today's moderator, Gavin from Informa Pharma Intelligence. The floor or the screen is yours, Gavin. Here you go.
Thank you, David. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining the webinar this afternoon around regulatory compliance. My name's Gavin Steele. I lead the Pharma Intelligence EMEA business development team. I'm located over in our London HQ. I'll be quickly running through the agenda for the session today and giving a very top-level introduction to Informa as a whole. So if we just flow on to that next slide. Today's session around regulatory compliance will be ran by Elizabeth and Tom. So just going into a bit around the profiles. Elizabeth is the Director of Clinical Solution at TrialScope, Informa's most recent exciting acquisition. Elizabeth is based out of New York, where she's responsible for providing organizations with recommended strategies to support clinical trial planning and execution around patient engagement and recruitment. Thomas is the Chief Strategy Officer at TrialScope, where he's responsible for tracking regulatory requirements, patient engagement, and clinical data sharing trends. Thomas is based out of New Jersey and has over 23 years experience with compliance management solutions. In terms of the agenda today, Tom will be covering from the global scope of disclosure to the data lifecycle, and Elizabeth will be presenting the two remaining topics around patient engagement and recruitment. Additionally, at the end, we'll be opening up for an interactive Q&A session, so please get involved. So moving on to who are Informa Pharma Intelligence. So we're a leading provider of drug, device, company, clinical trial and market intelligence in the pharmaceutical and medtech markets. So we're a global research and data analytics business headquartered over in London. So considering the 4 key pillars as to why Informa serves the leading life sciences companies globally, we're a trusted partner. So when you partner with Informa Pharma Intelligence, our global team assists our pharma, biotech, and life sciences clients to make informed decisions across the clinical, commercial, and regulatory continuum and execute with precision. To touch upon industry experience and our subject matter experts, we draw upon our team consisting of over 450 in-house analysts, consultants, and journalists with deep subject matter expertise, evidence-based data combined with superior geographical coverage of key developed and emerging markets. Flowing into the data and technology expertise, Informa is a FTSE 100 company, enabling us to deliver unparalleled integration and ultimately results to our partners. This is either through our syndicated software offerings or more custom bespoke engagements. In summary, we enable companies to maximize opportunities, mitigate risk, and deliver upon actionable insight. So Informa recently joined the MVA, and we're really excited to introduce ourselves and share valuable insight around the clinical, commercial, and regulatory landscape to the wider community. And at this point, I'm going to pass over to Tom Wicks. I hope everybody enjoys the session today. And again, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Gavin. I appreciate the introduction, and welcome to everyone to our webinar today. I thought I'd start off. So the first part of this is going to be just to give a brief overview of clinical trial disclosure requirements, but then how that flows into supporting patient engagement and recruiting and other elements. Many organizations are making quite considerable investments in their disclosure operations, or they realize that they should be making those investments. But it really doesn't end there. It doesn't have to be such a targeted work that's being done. If you look at it more broadly, it's a way of communicating clinical trial information to multiple stakeholders. Yes, you have regulatory requirements that you have to meet, but in meeting those, you can also leverage that data for other purposes. And I thought I'd start off, I was interested to understand who the Silicon Valley Alliance members are and kind of where the trials are being conducted. So as best as I could tell, I pulled this information a couple of weeks ago from the UDRCT or the EU CTR system. So this represents a view into which EU countries and the UK have clinical trials conducted by MVA members. So that's kind of taking that data source. I thought it was interesting that Spain was the most prevalent country in which to run trials there. And to note, Spain has a clinical trial registry. If we take a bigger step back and have a look at globally where are trials being conducted by the Alliance membership, it's a very global organization and a very global alliance. So you can see in almost every country in the world, and in most countries, including most countries in Africa, there is a very strong representation of clinical trials. It's a little bit more weighted towards the US in this chart, just because the data source is clinicaltrials.gov. But nonetheless, you can see that it's a very global issue. Now, what makes that relevant is that in many of these countries, actually in all the countries in which the Silicon Valley Alliance is conducting trials, there are some disclosure regulations. So you can see those pins all represent local registries. And I'm not claiming that this is a comprehensive, but it is a fairly representative view of in what countries are you disclosing data publicly, or your CROs or partners or local affiliates are doing that on your behalf. When we look at that in a broader context, we're seeing about two new registries opening up per year. It'll be interesting to see what happens in 2021, but this is a globally complex issue that we're looking at. So this is why organizations are making investments. Academic institutions, hospitals, and so on tend to disclose primarily in one country or one region, but pharma biotechs were often running this very globally. So with that, and I'm not going to harp on this too much, but I did want to bring it up because there's been some changes in the last week alone. This, in many countries, is a regulatory requirement. And we're now beginning to see first enforcement action in that regard. So we know in Europe that some inspections have started, at least before Brexit. We know the MHRA has requested evidence of compliant disclosure from companies running clinical trials in the United Kingdom. We know that Denmark and France, the health authorities there, have published some sense of how they are going to be enforcing the new EU clinical trial regulations that goes into effect, or sorry, goes into application in January of 2022, assuming that the clinical trial information system goes live as planned in a few months. So with that launch, the health authorities will then also have then it's regulation, and therefore there will be enforcement. France has announced, for example, that they're looking at fines of 15,000 euros for non-compliance. And I don't know if there's a financial penalty that Denmark's announced, but over the next few months, we're going to see the other member states publish their approach to inspections and compliance. And then if we look a little bit further down the line, just want to make sure I don't go over. In the US, the FDA has issued guidance on how they're going to issue penalties, how they're going to run inspections. They're part of the centers inspections, the BMO inspections. And actually last week was the first time that they made a public announcement where a pharma company was found to be non-compliant. They received a notice of non-compliance. I'm going to talk about that in the next couple of slides briefly, but then I want to pivot to the concept of using this data more broadly. And it's not just health authorities that are inspecting. We also found some membership organizations. So in this case, it's the PMCPA, and I forget what that stands for, but they're part of the Association of the British Pharmaceutical Industry, and they audited their members. And we know some of their members were fined by the alliance, by this association, excuse me, £3,000 for every trial that was non-compliant. Essentially cleaning house and taking charge of compliance on behalf of their members. But I did want to circle back to the announcement from last week. This information is public. So this notice of non-compliance, for those of you who want to kind of get a little bit more detail around that, there's been articles, but I'm assuming that the articles will really only come out with the first one or two of these notices. And after that, it will become kind of standard and there won't be a lot of attention paid anymore. Nonetheless, if you go to clinicaltrials.gov, you can actually search those violations. If you go to advanced search, that's a filter option. And what you see there is it'll give you a list of the non-compliant trials. And then if you open up the trial, there's now a new tab on there that tells you what the violation is. So this is a publicly visible notice that will evolve over time. So as this pharma company addresses the issue, we are assuming, though we don't know yet for sure, that this FDA 801 notice in the lower right corner will be updated. But I just wanted to show you that this is also publicly available. Of course, we are all used to the public assessments by industry critics and transparency advocates. I would assume that most of you have looked at the UDRA-CT or the EU trials tracker. So that's looking at compliance with the EU regulations in terms of what data have been disclosed, what results have been disclosed on UDRA-CT. There's a similar one in the US called the FDA trials tracker. And then for products that are approved in the US, so for those of you that work with biopharmaceutical companies, there's the Good Pharma scorecard. All of this is to say that this compliance is public and it supports sort of the image and the brand and the perception of your organization. You want to be listed favorably on these trackers. Overall, and I did this just for the EU results, I looked at how compliant are the members of the Medicon Valley Alliance based on the EU trials tracker. So I looked at all of your stats, I aggregated them, and you can see that there's a 93% compliance with results disclosure. It's really only beaten by large industry sponsors who have made quite considerable investments, though of course some of those large industry sponsors are also Medicon Valley Alliance members, and so that will bring that number down because their trial portfolios are so large. In general, academia, healthcare, and small sponsors tend to be fairly non-compliant, with over 50% of their studies missing results in the public view. I won't harp on this, just wanted to mention it. But let's sort of toggle a little bit about, just to understand what the scope of it is, and then let's move into how we can leverage this data and do more with it. So all of this started now almost 21 years ago with protocol registration that was required in the US for a certain subset of data. Of course, now many places have protocol registration, or elements of the clinical trial application are made public, for example, in the EU. Starting since 2005, some requirements were around disclosing the study synopses, which ideally is in an ICHE3 format, but everyone does it differently. Then we had results for approved products, then CSRs. This was in Europe, on the policy 43 for qualified requests. Now we have requirements for unapproved products, results of unapproved products. This is driven by the EU requirements, and but now also in the US. In the US now, also when you do the results, it's the full protocol and SAP. Starting in January of 2022, assuming CETIS goes live, will be a requirement for every study that's on the new CETIS system. When results are disclosed, you must accompany that with a plain language summary. Some folks call them lay language summaries, but patients prefer the term plain language summary. So you'll see that as the preferred term. And then eventually, and we're not exactly sure when, the EU regulations also requires a disclosure of anonymized patient data, though they haven't announced how and when that will be done. But now let's sort of pivot, and I'm going to transition slowly over to my colleague, Liz, to give her a chance to kind of dig a little deeper into this. But two things before we do that. Just wanted to talk about the path of the disclosure data. So it starts off with various source documents. So as you run a trial, you're describing that in the protocol. Some of that will be made publicly available. When you do results, if you're a biopharmaceutical company, you'll be writing up a CSR, a clinical study report, but others you will also be summarizing those results in some form, some clinical data management system, whether it's SAS or R or Excel. But these data are being collected, and then ultimately the results are then pushed out. And how do you get them out to the registries? Many organizations and a growing number of smaller companies as well now are turning towards commercial systems, such as ours, such as TrialScope Disclose, for preparing the data and making sure that it's consistent across the registries. But other organizations, and especially like individual researchers and so on, will have homegrown disclosure systems, Excel, some kind of tracking, or just go directly to the registry or go directly to the UDCT system and just enter data there and manage it in a calendar somehow to make sure that you're compliant there. And then ultimately this data then, and the next step is it flows to the clinical trial registries. This is just sort of a sampling of the ones that are recognized by the World Health Organization. But of course, there's a lot more. We count at least 40 that are of a more significant size. From a disclosure perspective, people often think, well, that's the end of that data lifecycle, but in fact, it's not. The data then go on to be reused from these registries, and sometimes they're reused on trial websites. So you see those logos on the left side of that last box on the right. So Novo and Bayer and PTC and so on, they have clinical trial finder websites where a lot of this data is presented again But unlike the trial registries, which make that information very difficult to understand for, excuse me, for the public, is not in a patient-friendly format. These trial finders are specifically designed to display the data in a patient meaningful and relevant way. But also others are pulling that data, and either they have their own websites or they're going to the registry. So we have recruiters are looking at that information. They rely on timely data from the registries, and also patient advocacy groups are surfacing the information from the registries. And all of this is to say that the data lives, and that doesn't even count other sort of tertiary uses of this information. So if you're a for-profit company, you'll probably know that investor analysts are very heavily looking at that information, whether it's Wall Street or London or wherever that financial centers are. They're very keen in looking at that. But really, from this perspective today, we're talking more about patient engagement and recruitment. And all of this information is the same data, and it really is important. There we go. Oop, sorry. I have to, something went wrong here. Let me try that again. I apologize for that. Let me go here and there we go. Sorry about that. I'm going to stop touching it. So what we have, and this is what I will close with, is we're looking at authoring the data with disclosure in mind. So again, we saw the registry systems, the trial milestone data, and the clinical documents. Those all go out to the registries again, the recruiters, the patient advocates. But in the meantime, there are sets of data that are usefully and meaningfully shared. And so with that useful and meaningful sharing, these are the data elements that are most relevant to the patients, based on research and on patient interviews, patient panel discussions. And as you can see, for example, the study title, the description, the outcomes, the inclusion-exclusion criteria, all those elements can be written in a plain language format that's acceptable to the registries, that's acceptable to UDRA-CT, like the brief title, for example, or the description. And those are then meaningfully reused in other places so that the data are consistent. So with that, I'm going to turn over to my colleague, Liz, who's going to talk a little bit more about how that actually then works. So Liz, all over to you. Liz, I'm not able to hear you.
Great, thank you, Thomas.
Yep.
Can you guys hear me now? I'm trying to make sure we can start at the first slide and go back here. Yep. If you wouldn't mind exiting and starting from the prior slide.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry about that, and we'll get it started shortly. So while we're getting the first slide up there, thanks, Thomas, for those first remarks. And with the rest of the presentation, I'll walk you guys through really the transformation around the use of clinical trial data, as well as disclosure data today. And so really, how can that be used beyond compliance and meeting regulatory requirements? And so a couple of those areas that come to mind are patient engagement and education, as well as supporting the recruitment process. And so through the next couple of slides, what I'll do is walk through why is this important and what's driving a lot of this transformation and use of this data and reuse by sponsors. And then take a look at some of the things that we're seeing in the industry where this is impacting or changing the timelines and what sponsors are doing. And then we'll actually dive into a couple of examples of what organizations are doing in each of these different pillars. And so with that, I thought to start with the why is this important and what's driving these changes here.
So you may have to request access again because I stopped sharing.
Great. So there's two areas that come to mind when we're talking about driving the reuse and transformation of this data to support areas on why this is so important and what's driving this. And so the first one is looking at clinical trial education and engagement. And so I think we're all very familiar that study awareness and understanding of clinical trials in the industry as a whole can present challenges. So when the information is not readily available or out there, it's hard for us to get the education and study components in front of the people that we often need to help participate in these trials and those different stakeholders. With that, there's a need to always engage patients and retain patients. So whether that is prior to and looking for them to prospectively participate in a trial, simultaneously while they're participating in a trial, retaining them throughout that period, and then engaging them potentially for future trials from their engagement experience. Also, for those folks that are involved, there's always there's a pressure to share more information back with those stakeholders in the trial. And some of these are the key areas or challenges driving the educational component. And to bring this to life, we're often seeing now over 40% of individuals that are looking to participate in a trial are now seeking out an internet search. So they're innovating their journey to find clinical trials. Over 85% of patients find it important to receive a summary of the results of the trials that they participate in. And so this is very critical when you think about their experience and their network and circles of experience, and ensuring that we can accelerate a lot of the research out there by creating this experience where people want to participate again. And then the last point here is, over 61% of participants didn't receive results from their study. And so those 2 points alone, we can see the gap, which presents an opportunity for us to really transform and share back more information from that perspective. The other big area that comes to mind and where we can transform and reuse this data is around the recruitment process. So study enrollment itself, but also the process. Both of those can be extremely complex. When you think about the trial data that is being used and disclosed onto registries, and ultimately that data is being relied on by stakeholders of clinical trials. So those that are trying to match and find patients, the patients themselves trying to understand their best treatment options. In addition to that, the enrollment process can be tricky, and finding through that data that exists out there today, how can I action this? How can I participate? And so these are some of the challenges around the process itself, where we can really use information that is out there today and being invested in other areas of business to really drive improvements and successes here. Hand in hand, when you think about the complexity of the study data itself, this can lead to candidates that are poorly qualified being sent to your sites. And so this has downstream impacts for the patient's time, the site's time, site burden, as well as the money and investment being poured into this specific study by the sponsor. And then the last area is competition and scarcity for patients around study recruitment. And so this could be because we're recruiting for a niche population where the patient population is very hard to find. But this could also be, the lack of awareness and really knowing how you can action and take next steps. And so there's really some opportunities here to use this data to improve the processes around recruitment. Some interesting statistics from the recruitment side of things. Because of these challenges, driving a lot of them, of course, there's others. Over 85% of clinical trials don't reach their targets within the specified time periods. Many of the patients that are sent to your sites will screen fail. So part of the challenges around matching and pre-qualifying up front. And then this ultimately leads to operational costs for the sponsor. And so there's a lot of impact for many of the different stakeholders from this perspective as well. And to summarize the opening, looking at this, there's really a lot of opportunity to reuse the data that's out there today, that's being used and disclosed onto registries, that's being used for other purposes and the clinical operations and development processes, to really find ways that you can innovate and repurpose this to impact other areas of the business, especially around engagement and recruitment. And so with that, we'll move to talk about how the industry impacts this and then jump into a couple of examples. And so when you think about the rate and the number of sponsors and organizations that are innovating the use of this data, one of the big areas that's driving this is the public interest. And so public awareness of clinical trials has been increasing over the last 5 years. COVID-19, I think we've all learned a lot. This has been a huge accelerator. And so you have many new stakeholders that are have information readily available, and they're learning through the pandemic and through other circumstances coming their way, really what are clinical trials and becoming more immersed in the research community. And with that, the number of stakeholders are growing. So the number of stakeholders in terms of groups, but as well as the number of individuals that are a part of these groups. And so a couple of these areas, the first is recruiters. So you have recruitment organizations that rely on trial data at its source to match and find patients into trials. This is nothing new that recruitment companies are out there today. I think one of the things that we're seeing now are the boundaries for what a recruitment company is categorized as is changing and expanding. So you no longer have your traditional recruitment companies. You also have non-traditional companies that have access to valuable patient communities entering as a clinical trial stakeholder. And so this could be diagnostic companies, screening companies, labs, for example, and even different health communities that are out there. Another area is advocacy and nonprofit organizations. These organizations are very reliant on the study materials as well as educational content for their communities. And so they need to be able to understand and point their communities to trials that might be relevant and in hopes to take action and finding treatment options from that perspective. And then the last two areas are caregivers and patients, which we see growing and increasing with the number of diseases and trials and treatment options out there today. And I think when we talk about the industry changes and what impacts the number of caregivers and patients, we're often seeing these individuals now coupling or complementing, going outside of their point of care to look for treatment options, or even if they're interested in helping advance research. So with that, there's a number of stakeholders that are involved and reliant on this data and really use this at its source for their different initiatives here. So sponsors are sharing and increasing the amount of information they're sharing back to support different transparency efforts. Some of these efforts, education, so giving stakeholders educational materials on diseases, or what is a clinical trial? What is it like to participate? What are the benefits of clinical trials, and why should I be a part of this research community? They're also sharing information to engage communities. So giving them reasons, why this might be a good fit for them. Additionally, for enrollment purposes. So, I'm interested in a trial. How can I participate? What are my next steps? Where do I go? So trying to take that data and evolve it for different call to actions for these groups. As well as retention. So retention for those folks that are a part of the trial, or maybe they're completing a trial and looking for results thereafter, or maybe they're interested in participating in future studies or future cohorts. This can all be, the sponsors are all sharing information back to support these different efforts here. And so this is a lot of the reasons that drive this in summary. And so we'll walk through the education and enrollment, as well as the community component, and what sponsors are doing today, how they're repurposing their data and investment, and what that looks like now, and where it's going. And so the first level of this starts at education and awareness of clinical trials and studies themselves, and using this as a driver to increase engagement. And so we're often seeing sponsors and organizations hosting patient-centric clinical trial-focused website experiences, where there's patient-friendly information, it's digestible, there's data for them to immerse themselves in. These can be shown in multiple digestible formats that are engaging to a website visitor. And so here are two great examples where you see organizations providing that patient-friendly information on what are trials, why participate, what could this look like, and then having different multilingual components added on. And so giving these individuals multiple channels and ways to find this information, and then globalizing it by adding multilingual components, adding different languages to open up access of information that's critical to get information in front of other communities at a global scale. Another thing that we're seeing, and it's a really innovative approach to helping someone search experience and increase engagement once they are on your website, is providing a search experience that allows someone to search for relevant studies that are of interest to them. Being able to filter and refine these capabilities so that someone can easily learn about clinical trials and then immerse themselves in ones that are relevant to them. And so these are some of the positive benefits for the public lens. But for the sponsors and organizations hosting these websites, they're, in the projects we've been a part of, you see them taking the source data that's being disclosed to registries and funneling that right into the website. And so what happens is it's a very one setup. It's a seamless automation of the trial data that's being used in other areas of the business, going directly to the website. And from there, they don't have to worry about changing up the information once it's live. But what they've done up front is made the connection to their website and created templates for which this information can be fed through. And so just having that automation of data into a website, into something that's been set up, that's digestible and an intuitive feel for the website visitor, can really impact the engagement for that sponsor. The next area and evolving use of these websites and the data itself is innovating approaches and evolving uses of trial and disclosure information to support recruitment, which we all know there's many complexities and challenges to get around in this area. And so this starts at the source. We talked a little bit about sponsors, organizations preparing this trial information expected by participants. This inevitably gets posted to different registries globally. into websites and then can be repurposed in digestible formats for patients to support direct-to-patient study engagement. And so a couple of great examples of where a company has used the source data to automate a website experience. They have the foundational components someone might need. And then they've even taken this a step further to provide different study-specific landing pages where they've created a template for all their studies up front. But then this information gets automatically ingested into these different study landing pages here. And the beauty of this is after the setup, I think we can all look at these and really digest the information so much more easily than you would on perhaps a registry view. And so now you're taking a potential participant on this education journey around immersing themselves in trial educational materials, providing them an experience where they can learn about a study within the same website experience, right? And now giving them that engagement, conversion point, and next steps to really participate in that study. So I think we see many patients not really knowing how to participate or where to go, which can be a challenge. And we've seen a couple of examples at a global scale where sponsors have plugged in interactive map experiences where they take site data, plug it into a map experience, give somebody call to actions such as an email box to triage questions, an email box to submit interest. And we're even seeing some sponsors innovating even further to this idea of pre-screening. So allowing a patient the opportunity to see if they might qualify for a specific enrolling study by answering a set of diagnosable questions up front. And should they pre-qualify, we're now sending potentially qualified patients to sites, which can have a huge impact in terms of conversion. And so these are created, we often see right from the eligibility criteria, so repurposing that data to create a better patient experience. And so from this point of view, there's really benefits for the process and experience for the patient, as well as improvements and successes that the sponsor organization might see from these efforts. And then the last area we'll touch on is, we see a lot of sponsors beginning to share more educational and engaging content, but now we're moving towards using this data to expand and develop upon relationships with trial communities. So taking beyond just the operational components and providing a community for which we're really engaging different stakeholders with information around research. And so I'll talk about kind of what this looks like now and what we're seeing in terms of where this is going. And so sponsors are increasing connections with communities around clinical trials. This can be in multiple types of communication channels. This can be in different formats on websites, dedicated areas for people to sign up and learn about information. The first kind of area we're seeing a lot of adoption around, and we'll be moving towards this in terms of results sharing, is providing dedicated areas for someone to follow up and see study results in patient-friendly or plain lay language, where somebody can view the information that came out of that study. This is also growing at a global scale. We see adoption of multilingual components here again. So another great point of opening up that access of information for other communities in this type of manner. And where this is going, there's a lot of great examples out there of sponsors that are creating more of a connection with patients by having forward-thinking initiatives of sharing information back. And so Thomas had touched on this a little bit earlier of moving from sharing results to, in the future, looking to find ways to share more patient data back. And so there's becoming these communities where we can start to share results and maybe information around future studies to really engage communities and expand the research community as a whole. And I think where this is looking forward is we'll move to figuring out and understanding better ways to get patients back data and more data over time to really support the engagement from those who are really making a difference by participating in trials. And so in summary, there's a lot of ways that clinical trial disclosure data can be repurposed, reused and transformed, starting with investments being made in areas of the business today, and using those with add-ons to really evolve the use of that data so that this can impact not only the external stakeholders that are reliant in using this data for many different areas, but also the sponsor's bottom line and impacting other areas of the business too. So with that, there's a lot of things that can be done beyond compliance, and we're seeing a lot of innovation happening here today. And with that, I will conclude the presentation. We have about 15 minutes to answer any questions from the attendees. As a reminder, you can use the Q&A box below to insert questions that Thomas and I will do our best to answer.
Great. Yes, please do use that Q&A function. The first one I see up here is whether this is the same. I guess this is going back to an earlier section around disclosure requirements, whether it's the same regulations for pharma trials as medical devices. And the truth is that depends on the country. In the US, medical devices must be disclosed on clinicaltrials.gov with results in a very similar way to pharma companies. There's slightly different regulations, but nonetheless, yes, they have to be disclosed. In Europe, at the European Union level, there is, as of yet, no medical device trial registry, but with the medical device regulations coming out, that will change. There will be a Europe-wide registry of clinical trials for medical devices, though I believe that one won't be hosted by the European Medicines Agency, but rather by, I forget, kind of more of an industry-focused one. So please use that Q&A function. I'm going to look at a couple of others. So Liz, looks like this question is more for you. In your experience, how often are organizations building these trial websites that you just showed for a global audience with localized content for different countries rather than sort of an English-only website?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I can speak from just the experience of kind of what we've seen and what's out there. And a lot of the projects we've been a part of, I think that many organizations start building websites in like one language and then looking to evolve this to add multilingual components. So adding additional languages, and I talked about opening up access of information, so that can be really big to help those initiatives. And then the other thing is we also work on projects where sponsors add on components of a technology called geofencing, which inevitably allows when a user is visiting a website to view something specific to their region via their IP address. And so when we are building global websites, we often start small and then evolve that to add on different functionality, multilingual components and technology where it's appropriate with long-term goals.
Great, thank you. I'm going to take one myself here. I see a question here. Are there any risks to consider with extensive data sharing? So to use the German Jein, yes, no. The risks are perceived to be, well, one, you have to make sure that the data are properly de-identified or anonymized so that you don't risk re-identifying patient information. That's kind of probably the biggest concern. There is some concern around IP, so the ability to issue patents or the ability to compete and keep certain things for yourself. And that then very much depends on the life cycle of the product development. So for example, many companies are choosing to share clinical study reports, the full clinical study report, which can be hundreds of thousands of pages of information. They'll de-identify it, of course, and they'll redact certain very limited amounts of company confidential information. But those are typically then made available only after the product has been approved or a decision has been made not to seek approval. It's rare that the full study report, for example, is made available for a phase 1 or 2 study, at least waiting until phase 3s are done. So it depends a little bit on the company's perceived risk. Posting clinical results on clinicaltrials.gov, UDRCT, and other registries per their requirements, disclosing study synopses in an ICHE3 format, for example, doesn't really pose a realistic risk. Just make sure that if you are a commercial sponsor or are you looking to look at protecting the patents, that you confirm with your patent lawyers everything you are about to disclose. Let me go sort of a question for maybe both of us, Liz, and you can start off here. Do you see repurposing clinical trial transparency data sort of being done equally applied to data disclosed in the EU and the US, or is it kind of more of a US-centric model? What's your perception, experience there?
Yeah, so I could touch on that from the engagement and recruitment components. I think in a lot of the ways we've worked with sponsors today, they often will start in the US, especially when you think about regulations of recruitment and enrollment at a global scale across many regions. And so they will deploy a US focused area. And now we've moved towards gravitating, adding on global components. So as part of the evolution, I think areas in Europe and eventually APAC are bigger areas that we see the use of this data being used. And you see early adopters of that today, where they're doing this at smaller scales in specific regions, and then have goals to add this on at later components.
Yeah, I can support that from what I've seen. The reason clinicaltrials.gov or US comes up regularly is because that registry is orders of magnitude larger than any other registry. So there's about 370,000 trials on clinicaltrials.gov. UDRCT, I think, is around 38,000 trials now. So you can see it's almost 10 times smaller. But it depends very much where are you running your studies, right? So if you're a European member of the Medican Valley Alliance and you're running studies more or less exclusively or mainly in Europe, Spain, as we saw, then the data source would be more likely the same information that you're supplying to the clinical trial application, the results that are being made available on UDRCT. Having said that, wherever you are disclosing results and protocol information, whether it's your own websites, whether it's patient communications or the registries, all that should really be the same information. So you should be centralizing the disclosure components and agreeing how you will describe this trial in public on the various registries and on your own websites. So let me go on to, that's just another country question for you, Liz. How do companies address reusing data for public websites across different countries?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think this goes with the other one we got about deploying these websites at a global scale. I think the big thing to keep in mind is across regions, there's different regulations around what information can be shared on top of adding multilingual components. And so one of the big things that we take into account when we're looking at additional countries to share information with is looking at those local rules, regional rules around social sharing, or what can and can't be shared around recruitment or engagement, for example. And so this is really where the idea of what's called geofencing technology can come into play to suppress things that you might not want to share based on IP addresses in certain countries. And then, of course, looking to, in those countries, add the localized language to ensure that you're opening up access of information and for the folks in that region to have their local language there.
Thanks, Liz. I'm going to take the next one, and this is harking back to the question from the FDA made that announcement about the notice of non-compliance where they called out Acceleron. And the question was, do I think there's a particular reason why that company was called out with a notice of non-compliance? And I don't think they were targeted in any way. What we understand has happened is that the FDA, the centers of the FDA have just started inspecting and including this as part of their inspections is compliance with FDA 801, which is the regulations. And with that, they have already issued what they call 40 pre-notifications of non-compliance. So that's essentially they're coming in, they do an assessment, they do an inspection, and then they list you sort of 40 of letters went out and saying, we found some trials that were non-compliant. You've got 30 days to fix it. And let's say it was 40, 39 of those organizations were able to address the issues within the 30 days, and one organization was not. So I don't think this is in any way targeted. What is interesting, I think, was that there was a general perception, especially among smaller companies, that those inspections would target primarily the top 20, top 30 pharmaceutical companies. And that's clearly not happening. It's, you know, the company that was caught out last week, I think they had 25 trials on clinicaltrials.gov. So it's a much more modest sized trial portfolio. So I think the truth is, this is just now part of their standard inspection. So whenever you have an inspection coming up, you should be aware of that. In Europe, those inspections that have happened have typically occurred during a pharmacovigilance inspection. So if you have a QPPV, make sure that they know and are prepared to answer questions around compliance with the EU trials tracker. Because as we saw, 7% of studies put out there by alliance members are non-compliant. So with that, I'm going to take one last question and then we'll wrap this up. And then David, maybe you can jump back in again. So for you, Liz, are there specific study areas where you see the innovation of data for recruiting being adopted through digital channels like websites? You know, where are patients getting their point of care versus online?
Yeah, that's another great question. And I think with this one, what's interesting is we're seeing this being adopted more recently than perhaps the evolution of the website and reuse of transparency data there. So many of the studies that we've had experiences working with and going through digital channels, in this instance, you have to think about the disease diagnosis and what that looks like for the patient. And so is this something where they're going to their point of care, or perhaps they're taking matters into their own hands and looking for other treatment options? And, you know, is this something that could be addressed and diagnosed by the patient themselves without their point of care or the physician that treats them? And so in this instance, a couple of examples, something like diabetes or asthma, you might, you know, you have, and you might be looking for better treatment options out there for you. Whereas a therapeutic area such as oncology, we will often see point of care being a primary point to match patients into trials. Mm-hmm. But then we do find value in complementing for those folks that move towards looking for other treatment options through digital channels. And so with that, there's no silver bullet with recruitment, but we're seeing, based on disease, a combination of approaches, or certain diseases where one approach might be a good primary start versus others.
Great. Thank you so much, Liz, and thank you to all the attendees. Thank you also to Medican Valley Alliance for hosting us today. So with that, David, I'm going to turn back over to you.
Well, thank you very much. I guess it's a wrap, as they say. And on behalf of Medican Valley Alliance, I would just like to say au revoir, auf Wiedersehen, see you later. I hope it's been time well spent, and that you have appetite for more information from Informa Pharma Intelligence, but also more Medican Valley Alliance events in the future. As mentioned earlier, feel free to reach out to me if you have if you want to know more about Medican Valley Alliance, about the event concept, about the membership. We actually expect to relaunch these meetings also as face-to-face meetings, hopefully in late August. Finally, of course, I would also like to thank Informa Pharma Intelligence, Gavin, Thomas, Liz, for teaming up with us today. And with that said, I think we have reached our destination, so to speak, and can conclude this afternoon webinar. So take care out there.
Thank you. Bye-bye.